You know, there's a certain kind of quiet that only settles into a house after a storm has passed. I'm not talking about a storm of wind and rain, but one of words and wills. The kind that rips through a family and leaves a strange, hollowed-out silence in its wake. It's a profound quiet, filled with the ghosts of things that were said, and the deafening relief of things that will never need to be said again. That's the quiet I live in now. And to truly understand its peace, you have to understand the crushing noise that came before it. It all started with a house. My house. Don't picture anything grand. It wasn't a sprawling estate from a magazine. It was a modest, two-bedroom bungalow built in the 50s, nestled in a quiet, leafy suburb, where kids still ride their bikes in the street. It had a covered front porch perfect for summer evenings and a backyard big enough for a small vegetable garden and a grill. I bought it myself when I was 28, with a down payment scraped together from years of freelance graphic design work, of saying no to vacations and fancy dinners the day I got the keys. I didn't even own a real bed. I slept on an air mattress in the middle of the empty living room, surrounded by cans of paint and takeout boxes, and I'd never felt richer in my life. This house was more than wood and drywall to me. It was my declaration of independence. For the next 3 years, I poured my soul into it. I spent weekends on my hands and knees, prying up old linoleum and painstakingly refinishing the original hardwood floors underneath. I learned how to patch drywall from YouTube tutorials. I waged war with a perpetually leaking toilet, a battle I eventually won with more profanity than plumbing skill. Every scuff on the baseboards, every slightly crooked nail I hammered myself. They were my battle scars, my marks of pride. This house was my sanctuary. It was the one place on this spinning planet that was unequivocally, legally, and spiritually mine. And then, just as I was finally feeling settled, my parents' world fell apart. It was a slow-motion collapse they had hidden from me for years. A story that's become painfully common in America. My father, David, a quiet, gentle man who could build anything with his hands, had been downsized from his carpentry job. My mother, Helen, had made a series of bad investments based on a can't-miss tip from a friend. They had refinanced their home to cover debts, then taken a second mortgage. It was a house of cards built on pride and fear, and it finally came crashing down. The bank foreclosed on the house they lived in for 30 years, the house where I took my first steps, where every doorway had pencil marks tracking my height. Suddenly, David and Helen, my mom and dad, were in their late 60s, with no home, a decimated retirement fund, and nowhere to go. The phone call when my dad finally told me everything is seared into my memory. His voice, usually so steady, was thin and broken. We lost it, Claire. The house is gone. My first and only instinct was to throw them a lifeline. Of course, it was. They were my parents, the architects of my childhood. Move in with me, I said, the words tumbling out before I'd even had a chance to think them through. The spare bedroom is empty. It's not huge, but it's warm, it's safe, and it's here for you. My dad protested, his voice thick with shame. Claire, we couldn't possibly. We can't be a burden on you like that. But my mother, Helen, ever the pragmatist, saw it differently, even through her tears. I could hear the gears of practicality turning in her mind. It would only be for a little while. Sweetheart, she said, her voice wavering but determined. Just until we get back on our feet. A year, maybe 2 at the most. I wanted to do more than just help. I wanted to preserve their dignity. I knew they came from a generation that didn't accept charity especially not from their own child. So, I proposed a solution I thought was brilliant in its fairness. We would make it official. We would draw up a lease. I wasn't thinking about protecting myself from them. The thought would have been absurd to me then. I was thinking about protecting their pride. A formal agreement would give them a sense of autonomy, of being contributors, not dependents. I paid a lawyer a few $100s to draft a simple, standard month-to-month rental agreement. A few days later, the three of us sat around my small kitchen table, the one I'd bought for $20 at a flea market and sanded down by hand. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, their shame, my anxiety, a shared grief for the home they had lost. I slid the documents across the table. "Okay," I said, trying to sound cheerful and businesslike. "Here it is. I set the rent at $400 a month. It's just enough to cover the property taxes and a bit of the insurance. And utilities. Is that okay?" It was a ridiculously low figure. A room for rent in my neighborhood went for at least double that, without utilities. It was a symbolic gesture, a way for them to feel like they were paying their way. My dad just nodded, his eyes fixed on the tabletop. But my mom picked up the papers and read them carefully. "This seems fine," she said, her voice gaining a bit of its old authority. We signed the copies. We drove to a nearby bank and had them notarized. It felt solid, responsible. It felt like the right thing to do, the adult thing to do. For the first few months, it was almost wonderful. It felt like playing house. My dad, relieved to have a purpose, threw himself into small projects. He fixed the wobbly railing on the porch, organized my chaotic garage, and built beautiful custom shelves for my office. He was quiet, grateful, and seemed content. My mom, Helen, immediately claimed the yard as her domain. The small patch of grass and dirt became her canvas. She dug up the struggling flower beds and planted vibrant, almost aggressive, rose bushes along the front walkway. She filled terracotta pots with bright red geraniums and arranged them on the porch steps. "The place just needs a little life," she'd announce, wiping soil from her hands onto her jeans, a genuine smile on her face. "A house needs flowers to feel like a home." I was thrilled to see her happy, to see her channeling her energy into something positive. I saw her actions as a form of healing, a way of nesting and reclaiming a sense of domestic control after the trauma of losing her own home. She started bringing home paint swatches. "This beige is so terribly drab, Claire," she'd say, holding a strip of colors against the living room wall. "What do you think of a nice, warm sage green? It would do wonders for the light in here, don't you think?" I'd smile and nod, non-committal. "It's nice, Mom. Maybe we can think about it down the road." In retrospect, the signs were all there, like tiny red flags I chose to ignore. It was the way she started referring to things. The mailbox became our mailbox. When she spoke to Mrs. Gable next door, she'd talk about the new mulch she was putting down in her garden. She once corrected me when I referred to the spare room as the guest room. "It's our room, dear," she'd said gently. They were subtle shifts in language, a slow, quiet creep of possessiveness. I wrote it all off as a figure of speech, an emotional slip born of her need to feel grounded again. I didn't see it for what it truly was. The first roots of a dangerous delusion taking hold. The delusion that because she lived here, because she was planting flowers and dreaming of paint colors, her name wasn't just on the mailbox. It was somehow, mystically, being written onto the deed. The fragile piece, the carefully constructed illusion of a happy, blended household, lasted for just over a year. And then it was utterly shattered by the most ridiculous, most insultingly insignificant amount of money you can possibly imagine. $4. That's what it took. $4 to expose the fault line running directly beneath my life. I received a letter from my mortgage company. It was the standard annual escrow analysis. My homeowner's insurance premium had gone up. It wasn't a surprise. Rates were climbing for everyone in the state. After the calculations, the net effect on my monthly payment was an increase of exactly $4. The price of a single cup of fancy coffee. A rounding error in a monthly budget. I'm a believer in transparency. And despite our unique situation, they were my tenants. So, I did what any landlord would do. I waited until a quiet afternoon and I called my mom to let her know. I even rehearsed the conversation in my head, planning to be gentle, casual, and matter of fact. In my mind, this was a non-event, a simple, 2-minute piece of boring, adult bookkeeping. I was profoundly, catastrophically wrong. "Hello." She answered the phone, her voice bright and cheerful. She was probably out in the yard. "Hey, Mom. Just a quick call with some boring house stuff." I started, trying to sound breezy. "I got the new statement from my mortgage company, and it looks like the home insurance went up a tiny little bit for the year. It means I need to adjust the rent just to cover the difference, starting next month. The new total will be $404. Silence. It wasn't a confused silence. It wasn't an "oh, that's annoying but okay" silence. It was a heavy, cold, and instantaneous silence. It was a vacuum. The kind of sudden, absolute quiet that makes the hairs on your arms stand up because you know it's the precursor to a sonic boom. "What?" she said, and her voice had dropped an octave, losing all its warmth. It was flat, sharp. "What did you just say to me?" My heart started beating a little faster. "I said the rent will be $404. I repeated, my voice a little shakier this time. "It's just to cover the $4 increase in the insurance premium. It's not for me. It's just a pass-through." And then, the eruption. $4. The word wasn't spoken, it was shrieked. It was a sound of such raw, venomous fury that I physically recoiled, pulling the phone away from my ear. "After everything we have done for this house, after all the hours of backbreaking work I have put into this garden, you have the unmitigated audacity to ask us for more money?" I was so stunned I couldn't form a sentence. I just stammered, "Mom, it's just $4. It has nothing to do with the garden. It's for the insurance. I don't want to hear your pathetic excuses," she yelled, her voice cracking with rage. "This is the most ungrateful, greedy, disgusting thing I have ever heard in my entire life. We are your parents. We took this drab little box and we poured our hearts and souls into making it livable. Those rose bushes cost money, you know. The new faucet I had your father install. The paint I bought for the guest bathroom, did you? Forget that. That is our investment, our sweat and our money. And you have the nerve to nickel-and-dime your own flesh and blood." My head was spinning. My reality felt like it was tilting on its axis. Investment? She was talking about a $40 can of Benjamin Moore paint and a few bags of potting soil. "Mom, that's not an investment. That's just—" "No, you listen to me, Claire," she seethed. "And this is the line that will be forever etched into my brain. The line that changed everything. You keep this up, and we'll see you in court. We have rights. We have invested in this property. A judge will see what's fair." And with that, she slammed the phone down. The crash echoed in my ear. I stood there in the middle of my kitchen. My own kitchen, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the hollow, mocking drone of the dial tone. Court. Sue me. Over $4. But it was never about the $4. I knew that in an instant, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in my bones. The $4 was just the key. It was the insignificant metal tooth that had been inserted into a lock I never even knew existed. And it had just turned, unlocking a hidden door. And behind the door wasn't just a disagreement. It was a tidal wave of resentment, of entitlement, and of a terrifying, deeply held fantasy. The fantasy that my house, the house I had paid for, bled for, and cherished was, in fact, her house. The notarized lease, the mortgage statements in my name, the property deeds sitting in my safe deposit box, all of it had been completely erased in her mind, replaced by the investment of a few rose bushes and a coat of bathroom paint. The hairline crack that had been forming for a year had just split wide open into a chasm, and I was about to find out just how deep it went. The days that followed that phone call were a surreal descent into a new kind of hell. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, and my mother, Helen, was the commanding general. My phone, once a tool for connection, became a weapon used against me. It started with the text messages. They would arrive at all hours, each one a perfectly crafted little missile of guilt and accusation. I couldn't sleep at all last night. I was just thinking about how you could value money over your own family. Your father is so hurt by this he can't even speak about it. I was just out watering the hydrangeas. Remember when I planted them? I guess that kind of contribution means nothing in your eyes. Just saw a house for sale down the street. They're asking a fortune. I'm sure our improvements have added at least that much value to your property. When the texts didn't get the desired response, I had gone completely silent. Too shocked to even engage. The phone calls began again. But the yelling was gone. It was replaced by something far more sinister. A calm, condescending tone, as if she were a forensic accountant who had discovered massive fraud and was patiently explaining my crimes to me. Claire, she'd say one evening, her voice dripping with false patience, regarding this supposed insurance increase. I'm going to need to see a copy of the official bill, and the property tax statement from this year, and last year as well. I need to conduct a full audit to see exactly where our money has been going all this time. Our money, I finally whispered back, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and utter disbelief. Mom, you pay a flat rent that we agreed to. It's a fraction of the market rate. It doesn't even cover the full cost of the taxes and insurance, let alone the mortgage. We'll see about that, she'd reply ominously, as if she held a trump card I couldn't imagine. Just send me the documents, please. We need to be transparent about these things. The most excruciating part of this whole ordeal was watching my father, David. He was a good man, a gentle soul caught in an impossible position. In the beginning, he tried desperately to be the peacemaker. He'd catch me in the hallway when Helen was in the shower, or call me separately when he was out running an errand. Claire, you know how your mother gets, he'd say, his voice weary and strained. She gets a notion in her head. She's just stressed from everything we've been through. Don't mind her. Let's just let this blow over. But it didn't blow over. It wasn't a summer squall. It was a Category 5 hurricane, and my mother was the eye of the storm, bending everything around her to her will. And slowly, inevitably, my father was pulled from his quiet harbor and dragged into her vortex. His attempts at mediation dwindled. He stopped calling. He stopped making excuses for her and started making justifications. He became her echo. The final shift happened one afternoon when I came home to find them both sitting at the kitchen table, a stack of receipts between them. "Claire," my father said, not looking at me, "your mother and I have been going over the numbers, the value we've added to the property. It's not insignificant." I just stared at him. "What are you talking about, Dad?" "Well," he continued, finally looking up, his eyes avoiding mine. "She has a point. That new faucet set, the custom mixed paint for the bathroom, the high-end mulch for the garden beds. We've put a lot of sweat equity into this place. It's only fair that it's properly acknowledged." Sweat equity. The term sounded so foreign, so corporate and ugly, coming from my father's mouth. It was her word. She had fed it to him, and he had swallowed it whole, digesting her delusion until it became his own. He was no longer on my side, or even in the neutral middle. He was on hers. They were a unified front, a grim partnership bonded by a shared fiction. It was the two of them against their greedy, ungrateful daughter who was trying to cheat them out of their rightful share. I felt like I was losing my mind. Every day I would come home from work to my own house and feel like an intruder. The air was thick with unspoken hostility. I would retreat to my bedroom, eating my dinner on my lap, just to avoid the suffocating tension in the common spaces. My sanctuary had become a prison. After 2 weeks of this unbearable Cold War, I knew something had to give. This couldn't be my life. In a last, desperate attempt at sanity, I suggested we all meet somewhere else, a neutral territory. I clung to the foolish hope that if we could just get out of the emotionally charged environment of the house, we could sit down, face to face, like 3 rational adults, and untangle this horrifying mess. We chose Denny's, the great American equalizer, a place so aggressively neutral, so steeped in the mundane, that it's hard to be overly dramatic over a plate of moons over my hammy. Or so I thought. We slid into a sticky vinyl booth under the harsh fluorescent lights. The air was thick with the comforting smells of bacon and burnt coffee, and the constant clatter of plates and silverware. I came armed. I brought a manila folder containing the signed and notarized lease, a copy of the new insurance bill highlighting the $4 increase, and a printout of my mortgage statement with all my personal financial information carefully blacked out. I was ready for a logical, fact-based discussion. I never even got to open the folder. Before the waitress could even finish pouring our waters, my mother leaned across the table, fixing me with an intense, predatory stare. "We need to have a serious discussion about our equity, Claire," she said, her voice low and firm, as if we were in a boardroom, not a booth at Denny's. My dad nodded solemnly beside her, his arms crossed. "Your mother and I have been doing some research," he said, in a tone I'd never heard from him before, stiff and rehearsed. "We've concluded that the landscaping work, the new light fixtures in the hall, and the plumbing upgrades have significantly increased the market value of your home." I stared at him. Not my mom, my dad, hearing the delusion spoken so plainly. In his calm, rational voice was somehow more jarring than my mother's fury. He truly, genuinely believed it. "Dad, Mom," I began, my hands trembling slightly under the table. I forced my voice to remain steady. "You planted some bushes and changed a faucet. That's not an equity investment. That is decorating. We have a legally binding lease agreement. You are my tenants. I am the homeowner. That is the fundamental, inescapable, legal and financial reality of this situation. Helen let out a short, sharp laugh of disbelief. She waved her hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "Oh, that little piece of paper," she scoffed. "That was just a formality for the bank or something. We all know that. This isn't about legal papers, Claire. This is about what is morally right." And then my dad delivered the line that made me realize that negotiation was not just failing. It was impossible. "I think," he said, leaning forward, his face a mask of earnest sincerity, "that the next logical step is for us to hire a professional real estate appraiser. Someone impartial who can come in and give us a fair, market-based assessment of what our share is worth. What we've put in." The blood drained from my face. An appraiser. To assess their share of my house. The delusion was no longer just a fantasy in their heads. They were planning to act on it, to bring in third parties, to try and formalize their fiction into a legitimate financial claim against me. That was it. The very last, gossamer thin thread of hope that we could solve this with a conversation just snapped. I looked at them. These two people who had raised me, taught me right from wrong, and now they were looking at me from across the table not as a daughter, but as a business adversary they needed to extract value from. The warmth, the love, the entire history of our family dynamic had been completely hollowed out and replaced by this toxic, imaginary financial dispute. I took a long, slow breath. The churning cauldron of anger, hurt, and confusion that had been boiling inside me for weeks finally cooled and solidified into something else. A cold, hard, crystalline resolve. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the diner's clatter like a shard of glass. "We are not hiring an appraiser." I looked my father in the eye, then my mother. "Here is the deal. There is only one deal. The rent is now $404 a month. As I stated 2 weeks ago, you can either pay it, and we will continue to abide by the terms of the notarized lease we all signed, or you can find somewhere else to live. I will give you 60 days to decide and, if necessary, to find a new place and move out." The word ultimatum hung in the air between us, uglier and more shocking than any of the accusations they had thrown at me. My mother's face went white with a mixture of shock and incandescent rage. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. My father just looked, lost. His manufactured confidence collapsed, leaving him looking frail and broken. At that exact moment, the waitress arrived, a cheerful smile on her face. "Hi folks. Sorry for the wait," she chirped, oblivious to the emotional carnage at her table. "Have we decided what we're having?" The profound, absolute silence that answered her was my answer. The meeting was over. The war had just been declared. After the Denny's disaster, a strange and unsettling quiet descended. It wasn't peace. It was the eerie calm of a cold war. They stopped speaking to me entirely. The barrage of texts and accusatory calls ceased. On the 1st of the month, a bank transfer for $404 silently appeared in my account. We were living under the same roof, but it was as if a thick wall of glass had been erected down the center of the hallway. We were ghosts to each other, sharing a space but not a reality. This silence was, in many ways, more terrifying than the shouting. It was the unnerving quiet of an army regrouping just over the hill. I knew, with every fiber of my being, that they hadn't given up. They were planning something. I just didn't know what. The answer arrived on a dreary Tuesday afternoon, about a month after the showdown at the diner. I was at work, trying to force my brain to focus on a design layout, when my phone buzzed with a call from a local number. It was Mrs. Gable, my sweet, eagle-eyed next-door neighbor. A woman in her 70s who had lived on that street her entire life and missed nothing. Claire, dear, she said, her voice a little hesitant, a little conspiratorial. I'm so sorry to bother you at work, but there's something a bit odd happening over at your house. My stomach clenched into a tight, cold knot. What is it, Mrs. Gable? Well, she began, there's a man here. A man in a suit. Looks like a real estate fella. He has a clipboard and one of those big measuring tapes. And he's walking around the property with your mother. He's taking pictures. And Helen, well, dear, she's showing him around like she's about to put the place on the market. Waving her arms at the porch and everything. I thought you should know. The design layout on my computer screen blurred into a meaningless swirl of color. The blood pounded in my ears, a frantic drumbeat of disbelief and rage. An appraiser. Despite my ultimatum, despite everything I had said, they had gone behind my back and done it anyway. But Mrs. Gable's words, like she's about to put the place on the market. My mother wasn't just getting her fictional investment valued. This was bigger, more audacious. She was actively, fraudulently, presenting herself as the homeowner. Thank you, Mrs. Gable, I said, my voice eerily calm. Thank you so much for letting me know. I'm on my way. I walked over to my boss's desk and said, I have a serious family emergency. I have to leave right now. It was the truest thing I'd said all day. The 15-minute drive home felt like an eternity. But I wasn't panicked. A strange, cold clarity had settled over me. I didn't speed. I didn't run red lights. I drove with a cold, precise fury. My mind was a steel trap. I knew, with absolute certainty, what I had to do. There would be no more shouting, no more arguing, no more pleading for them to see reason. The time for words was over. This would be settled with facts. I parked my car a block away from my house and walked, my footsteps steady on the pavement. And there they were, just as Mrs. Gable had described. A paunchy man in a cheap, slightly too tight suit, holding a clipboard and a camera. And my mother, Helen, she was in her element. She was animated, her hands fluttering as she pointed at the rose bushes with a proud, sweeping gesture. I could hear her voice carrying on the breeze, talking about the excellent southern exposure and the solid foundation. She was playing the part of the proud homeowner, the grand dame of the estate, trying to charm this stranger into validating her fantasy. My father was nowhere to be seen. This was her production, and she was the star. A surge of white-hot rage washed over me, so intense it made me dizzy. But I pushed it down, deep, deep down, locking it away. This moment required ice, not fire. I smoothed the front of my blouse, took a slow, deliberate breath to steady my hands, and I walked up my own driveway. The appraiser saw me first. He was in the middle of jotting down a note and looked up, giving me a polite, questioning smile, the kind you give to a curious neighbor. My mother's back was to me, and of course, we had the entire roof redone just a few years ago. She was saying, lying through her teeth about a roof I had paid nearly $10,000 for 2 years before they ever moved in. A major capital improvement. I walked right past her, not giving her a single glance. I stopped directly in front of the appraiser, forcing him to lower his clipboard. I held out my hand. Hello, I said. My voice was level, calm, and carried the unmistakable ring of authority. My name is Claire Adams. I am the owner of this property. The man's professional smile faltered. He blinked, looking from me to my mother, his brain trying to compute this new information. "Oh," he said. I felt, more than saw, my mother freeze behind me. The performance stopped mid-sentence. I could feel the heat of her glare on the side of my face. I heard her sharp, ragged intake of breath. The curtain had just been ripped down. The real owner had just walked on stage. I'm sorry," the appraiser stammered, looking at my mother, who was now as silent and still as a statue. "I was under the impression that you were Mrs. Adams, the homeowner." He trailed off, the professional embarrassment dawning on his face. My mother was silent. Her face, which had been flushed with the excitement of her charade, had turned a pasty, mottled white. The bravado, the righteous indignation, the entire fantasy persona she had constructed, it all just evaporated in the harsh afternoon light. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't say, "How could you lie like this?" I didn't call her out in front of this stranger. My weapon wasn't anger. It was the cold, hard, irrefutable truth. I reached into my purse, the same purse I carried every day, and I pulled out the manila folder I had tried to show them at Denny's. I opened it and took out the top sheet. It was a clean, crisp copy of the grant deed to the house. Clear, official, undeniable, bearing my name and my name only. I handed it to the appraiser. "This is my house," I repeated, quietly but firmly. I then took out my wallet and handed him my driver's license. As you can see, the name on the deed and the name on the ID match. I did not authorize or request an appraisal of my property today. The appraiser's face was a mask of pure, professional horror. He understood instantly. He had been hired under false pretenses and was now trespassing. He looked from the deed to my ID, then shot a single, fleeting, horrified glance at my mother, who stood as if she'd been turned to stone. "My sincerest apologies, ma'am," he said to me, his voice low and rushed. He practically shoved the deed back into my hand. He snapped his clipboard shut with a loud crack that echoed in the silence. "There has been a profound misunderstanding. Thank you for your time. I'll be leaving now." He turned on his heel and almost jogged back to his car. He didn't look back. He fumbled with his keys, started the engine with a roar, and drove away, leaving a small plume of exhaust in the still, silent air. And then, there were just the two of us, me and my mother, standing in the driveway of my house. The silence was absolute. Her grand conspiracy, her secret plot to build a paper trail of entitlement, had been publicly and humiliatingly dismantled. Not with a fight, not with an argument, but with a quiet, simple, irrefutable piece of paper. She had built a castle of lies, and I had just walked up and shown everyone it was made of sand. She wouldn't look at me. She just stared at the spot where the appraiser's car had been. She had been exposed, utterly and completely. In that moment, watching her shoulders slump, I think she finally understood. She had overplayed her hand. She had lost. I didn't hesitate. I didn't give her a moment to regroup, to invent a new narrative, to spin a new web of excuses or tears. Standing there in the driveway, in the wreckage of her failed coup, I delivered the final, necessary blow. I turned to face her, fully. She still wouldn't meet my eyes. Her gaze was fixed on her precious rose bushes, as if they were the only things in the world that wouldn't betray her. "Presenting yourself as the legal owner of this property to a third party for the purposes of a financial assessment," I said, and my voice was devoid of all emotion. It was not the voice of a daughter. It was the voice of a landlord. "Is a material breach of the lease agreement that we both signed and had notarized. It's a violation of trust and contract. I let the words hang in the air for a beat. Under the terms of that contract, I am hereby giving you official notice. I am terminating your tenancy. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. I didn't wait for a response. There was nothing more to say. All the arguments had been had. All the lines had been crossed. I turned my back on her, walked up the steps to my front porch, unlocked my door, and went inside, closing it firmly, but not loudly, behind me. The click of the latch was the final word. That night, for the first time in weeks, there was a soft knock on my bedroom door. It was my father. He looked 100 years old. His face was gray, and his shoulders were slumped in defeat. "Claire," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Your mother. She didn't mean. There's nothing left to talk about." "Dad," I said, cutting him off. But my voice was gentle. My anger was gone, replaced by a vast, weary sadness. "It's done. The decision is final." He just nodded slowly. The fight was gone from him. The delusion had been shattered by the undeniable truth, and he had nothing left to put in its place. There was no legal battle. There were no more threats of lawsuits. The game was over because I had finally and publicly refused to play. By bringing in a third party, my mother had inadvertently handed me the perfect, unimpeachable legal reason to end the arrangement she had so grotesquely twisted. She had handed me the sword herself. They didn't take the full 30 days. Within 2 weeks, they were gone. They rented a small apartment on the other side of town. The packing was done in a somber, heavy silence. I stayed in my room or went for long walks, listening to the funereal sounds of boxes being taped shut, of furniture scraping gently against the floorboards. It was the sound of my life being given back to me. On the last day, after the moving truck had pulled away, I found a single key on the clean kitchen counter. Beside it was a short, simple note in my father's familiar handwriting. It just said, "I'm sorry." I'll never know if he was sorry for the whole terrible ordeal, or just sorry that it had ended this way, that they had been forced to leave. Maybe it was both. My mother said nothing. She walked out of the house for the last time, got into their old car, and never looked back. Not once. The first morning I woke up after they left, the house was filled with that profound and deafening quiet I told you about. It felt huge, empty. I made coffee and stood in the middle of my living room, just breathing. The morning sun was streaming through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. There were no paint swatches on the coffee table. There was no one there to critique the color of the walls or to tell me what needed fixing. I walked outside onto the front porch, my mug warm in my hands. Her geraniums were still there in their pots, bright and cheerful. The rose bushes she had planted with such pride stood guard along the walkway. For a moment, a wave of grief washed over me, so sharp and intense it took my breath away. A grief for the family I thought I had, for the relationship with my mother that was now a cratered ruin. But then, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree in the yard. The sun warmed my face, and I took a deep, shuddering breath. The air wasn't filled with tension. It wasn't thick with unspoken resentment or the threat of impending conflict. It was just air, clean, fresh, and mine to breathe. I had lost my parents in a way that felt as final as death, but I had reclaimed my house. And more importantly, I had reclaimed my sanity, my peace. I had learned, in the hardest way imaginable, that boundaries are not a suggestion. They are not an act of cruelty. They are a profound act of self-preservation. And sometimes, the most powerful and loving thing you can do for yourself is to stand on the unshakable ground of truth. Hold up the deed to your own life, and refuse to let anyone, not even the people you love the most, tell you that you don't own it. The quiet in my house now is not an empty quiet. It is a peaceful one. It's a quiet I fought for, a quiet I earned, a quiet that is, finally and forever, all my own.